Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome in. We'll get started here in just a minute. We'll give another minute to our other guests and see if they're able to hop on. Also going to put a link in the chat to some slides for today.
Well, it looks like there's a lot on vacation.
Why possibly? Okay. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started, and then anybody who wants to join us, they'll be able to catch up pretty quickly. So welcome again, everybody. I'm so glad that you're here to join us today. My name is Taylor Goodwin. I am the Safe and Healthy Schools Coordinator for the Agency of Education. I'm very pleased today to be joined with a few members of the operations team, including our very own Bob Donahue, who's going to be giving us a wonderful explanation presentation about the facilities dashboard. Before I pass it over to Bob, just real quick, I will say if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop those in the chat or also use that raise hand function. So yeah, anytime, just drop those right in. So cool, Bob, I will go ahead and pass it over to you.
All right, Taylor. And is the presentation ready to load? Okay, cool.
Absolutely, I can share those slides right now.
All right. Well, while that's all happening, everybody, I think I know everybody on the call, everybody that is here. So everybody knows I am Bob Donahue. I joined the AOE back in May of 2023 as the School Facilities Program Manager. And at that time that I joined, the field assessments taking place in the schools were well underway. And one of the first things that I was tasked with doing is overseeing the completion of the facility assessments work and then pursue the development of a public-facing dashboard that would allow everybody to see all of the data associated with any of the work done in the field. And that's what brings us today to this topic of the facilities dashboard. So really today is just going to be looking at a review of the dashboard as it's set up now, and it's become available on the AOE website just a couple of weeks ago. And then it's just really to review a couple of the navigation tips when using the dashboard and provide an overview of the main pages that comprise the dashboard. All right, Taylor, next page, next slide, I mean. So I think I kind of much covered what the agenda is. It's basically just going through the background and purpose of what the facilities assessment project was. And then, yeah, we'll jump right into what the navigation tips are and then kind of just do a brief summary of what the pages are. I know this can seem like this is a drinking from the fire hose moment because the database that forms the basis of all the graphical and charts on the dashboard are pretty intense. And so they have a lot of information. So no one would expect that after a brief 1 hour webinar that everything makes sense. But I can say this, after having dabbled in the dashboard, it's somewhat intuitive, and navigating it is going to be no different than a lot of dashboards that we've probably all had to been exposed to without any kind of guidance. So I think it'll become straightforward as you start looking at the data. Okay, next slide. So just a brief summary as to what got us to this point. 2007, the Vermont General Assembly, they suspended the state aid for school construction program, and it's remained suspended ever since that time. And what that has revealed over time is the general recognition that there's a large development of deferred maintenance issues that permeates all of the schools across the state. And knowing that, then in 2021, the legislature enacted Act 72, which was an act that was specifically to deal with all things with school facilities. and concerns around that. And three of the main things that I've been working on as part of Act 72 mandates has been to oversee the completion, or the AOE was tasked with conducting the facilities assessment of all the schools around the state. But also in parallel with that, they're looking for the AOE to develop a 5-year capital plan template that all school districts could have at their disposal to use if they chose to. And then also establish guidelines for training and certification of school facilities managers. All right, next slide, Taylor. So a common commentary about the facilities assessments is that some of them weren't as detailed and as deep as one would have thought. But I think when we step back and take a look at what the state was asking the AOE to do, is it was to really conduct these facilities assessments as a first step towards informing higher level, state level discussions around the future of a state aid for school construction program. And they weren't intended to equal the more detailed facility assessments that would be conducted in the lead up to, say, a school construction project bond vote. And there are two different types of levels of detail involved with that. And these facilities assessments really were to garner a view of the total facility needs at a high level so that they could now start to inform those discussions around school construction and the reinstatement of a school construction program. All right, we'll get into the next slide. So when we think of the school facilities assessments, and when we get into the pages, I think you'll get a better feel for this. It's school facility, any building facility assessment, especially when you're talking about either a corporation or a large entity that has many buildings across a large area. What they start to take a look at is comparing one building to the next. And so these assessments oftentimes are used really to rank one building compared to another, and not necessarily are so granular in their facility assessment of the individual building. And I think that's a point that needs to be highlighted as we move forward through this whole discussion, because I think we're going to find that some of the findings weren't deep enough, and some of the findings actually were missing some things that were critical to people in the field that they know are issues, but that the one-day visit to a school wasn't able to uncover, or there wasn't enough time to talk with a point of contact at the school to actually ferret out some of the deeper issues that lie beneath that necessarily aren't seen when you're doing a cursory walkthrough. Okay, next slide. So the next part is there's two links here on this slide. The first one is the dashboard overview link. That takes you to the web page on the AOE website, where there is a discussion of the facilities assessments, what led up to them. Basically, it's a condensed version of what we're talking about here. But it just gives a paragraph that says this is what led up to the development of facilities assessments. And then it gives you the helpful hints on how to navigate through the dashboard. And then the second link on this page, on this slide here, is the actual, what actually takes you to the dashboard, which we'll now see in the ensuing pages coming forward. Okay, next slide. So when you click that second link on the prior slide, it'll take you, and this is the first page that you are come to when you get to that dashboard, and it's just a general introduction, just tells you what BBTA was tasked with doing by the AOE. And it just basically summarizes that this is filled with a bunch of data and statistics that people can explore and filter and use in whatever way that they find meaningful for themselves. Okay, next slide. And then this is where we actually get into the heart of the matter. And this is where this becomes a very useful tool in a way. And it can parse through a lot of tables of data very graphically. So the middle section there and kind of the tan is the dashboard introduction. And they do a wonderful job just giving you summary of what each of the tabs at the bottom of the screen and then in the bottom right of the screen actually are. But if we were to take a look at some of the pointers that I put into this screen, there's the filtering section on the left, and this is the main entry point where people now start to say, do I want to look at an individual school district? Do I want to look at an individual facility type, elementary, middle school, high school, a K through 12 school? Do I want to look at an individual facility? Do I want to look at facilities that are within a certain age? So they have spanned at 0 to 215 years. I don't think we have any that are 215 years old. But there's, and then the last condition on the filtering section there is the select the average weighted condition. And that gets into something where basically they've used a 5-level assessment for the condition of any asset that they put their eyes on. And it went from failed, poor, average, good, excellent. And each one of those is on the scale of 1 to 5. And then when they come up with this average weighted condition, they take what your weight is, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, and they're weighting that ranking by the dollars of each asset's replacement value. And so they do a weighted calculation for the condition, and it comes up with an overall weighted condition. It is a way to look at things. It may not be a way that some people find meaningful. And that I think you're going to find that's the case on most of these web pages. You may say, well, that's the data point that's not of interest, but you can do anything with the data that you want. So they'll take any kind of cost and they'll break out the cost according to square foot, according to person, according to district, according to the square foot per district. So some of these metrics, some people will find useful, others they may not. Up in the upper right-hand corner is the hamburger icon. Most every page has the hamburger icon. If you click on that, it just is another means of like a drop-down menu that usually comes up with some sort of explanation of the terminology or data being used on the particular page you're on. And then the double stacked arrows over there to the right below the hamburger icon, that's the legend. You can either collapse it or expand it. That legend, since this is a GIS map, you can do a search on any address you want. So if you typed in the address of your house, it would zoom in on the map to where your house is. But if you're specifically looking at schools and you want to type in, Harwood Union school district, it'll pull up the school district. If you type in an individual address for a school, it'll take you to the school. And then the legend is a way of telling you what does each of those circles mean. So these circles are varying in size, directly related to what the cost metric that they reflect. So if there's one school that has $100 per pupil, and there's another school that has $1 million per pupil in renewal costs, their circles will be much different size. The $1 million will be much larger. The small circle will be representative of the smaller expenditure. So it's a graphical way to look at it. The bigger the circle is, the more dollars that are being expended, and it could be expended if they were to spend according to the plan identified through the assessment. So that's what that legend takes care of. And then for each tab on the lower left, there are then a cluster of sub-tabs or nested tabs interior. And for us, that's the sub-tabs are beneath the map. And there you can see it's dollars per facility, dollars per square foot, dollars per student, dollars per district. So if you choose in the filtering section a particular district, all the other districts go away except the district you're focusing on. And then if you choose a particular facility type, if you wanted to see all the elementary schools, then it would just jettison the middle schools, the high schools, and it would just take a look at the elementary schools. And then for that selection from the filtering side, it would then only display in the sub-tabs the dollars per facility, dollars per student, just for that selection that you chose on the left filtering section. So this is the introduction to it. And for each slide that we go through, there's only 5 slides we're going to go through in terms of the dashboard, but each one will have a few other navigational tips in it that we can cover. Okay, I think the next slide. So this is the key indicator slide. Here you'll have the same kind of filtering section over on the left, the hamburger menu up on the right. And this also has the subtabs where we now start to get into more of the nitty-gritty costs of individual schools, individual school districts, individual school types. Um, and this is where we start to see it can show you, we can go into this, the life cycle renewal cost. So when they went and did the facilities assessments, they broke the categories of costs into five, I think, major categories. One was environmental, anything to do with environmental, another to do with ADA accessibility, one to do with life cycle renewal, which is you have equipment that just reached the end of its useful life, and then based upon when that useful life goes to zero, they then say in that calendar year, that's when you expend the money to renew that. And then in addition to those others that I just mentioned, there's safety related and then retrofit and adaptation. So safety related is clear. Anything to do with safety that they thought was a safety concern, they flagged that as a separate category. And then the retrofit adaptation is you may have had a space that was servicing for a certain use. Maybe it was a classroom to start, and now it's going to get a retrofit adaptation into some other use. So they would capture retrofit adaptation in a separate bucket for costs. Um, all those costs are summarized in the right-hand column. And these life cycle renewal costs are what they project out for the 20 years going forward. So that 6.22 billion is what the total costs over 20 years of their facilities assessment shows the state obligation would be if we were to expend the money at the pace every year that this facilities assessment study calls for. And broken up by the different categories that you see on that column. And then on the bottom beneath the graph, there are other metrics that take a look at what are the dollars per square foot for whatever facility you selected over on the filtering section to the left, average cost per student, and then square foot per student. And then the one that says the National School Lunch Program, that was just a poverty metric that's being used. I think there's discussions going forward whether or not that's going to be the most accurate one going forward. But it's the poverty metric that we use for the purpose of this, and that's the National School Lunch Free and Reduced Lunch Program that the schools have. And so this score is based upon where schools are currently with that poverty rating. All right, next slide. Okay, so now we get into another screen. This here are the systems, and we just have to go into that a little bit. The systems that are described here are something that falls under the uniformat classification of what systems are. And the uniformat system is just simply a way of classifying functional elements of a building, characterized really by what function they play in the overall structure of the building. So they're broken down as this shows: substructure, shell, interior, services, equipment, special construction, and site work. And in each of these elements, these categories, just about everything in the building falls. And so they itemized each asset according to where it fell within one of these uniformat code descriptions. And the speedometer graph for each one of these is really associated with what's the average remaining useful life of all the assets in each one of those uniformat classifications. And like a gauge, like your gas gauge, the lower you are on that gauge, the more money you would have to spend in order to get your building up to the 100%. And what that basically is saying is, if you were 100%, you would have a new building. The remaining useful life is whatever was projected going forward. As time passes and the remaining useful life gets smaller and smaller, the speedometer gauge would be coming closer and closer to zero. So if you were to click on the hamburger icon in the upper right on this screen, it would bring you the color chart that coincides with the ranges on those speedometer gauges. So 0 to 15% might be red, and then 15 to 40% might be yellow, or 50% rather. And then beyond that would be green. So the red, yellow, green gives you a kind of quick way to look at it and say, a lot of my building has systems that are well aged and would be wise to start planning going forward, spending money on getting them replaced. So the speedometer gauge, some people like because it is a graphical way to quickly get a feel for what things are. And then below those speedometer gauges, you have the actual dollars for each one of these uniformat systems of substructure, shell, interior, and so on. What are the dollars that go into making up all those? And then the donut chart is just another pictorial of how to visually express what is the breakdown by the different categories. Uh, so it's just another graphical way to get a feel for looking at the same data. And some people, and I think it's good, some people have different comfort levels looking at a spreadsheet as opposed to looking at this graphical type of display. But again, it's like the same filtering section over there on the left. So it's always coming back to, do you want to look at it at a district level? Do you want to look at it at a facility type, all the elementary, all the middle, or the high school? Or do you want to look at an individual facility, which would be the building? And then on some cases, if there was a technical school associated with a high school, they would do a campus report, even though it may have been all one connected building. They sometimes broke it out into two different buildings, and made that a multi-building report, which they called as a campus report. And sometimes it would be separated out as a separate facility. All right, next page. So this one here is where you can now do downloads to an Excel spreadsheet of any of the data that's contained on this page. And this is where we start going into projected 5-year spending. So same sort of thing on the left. The left is always the filtering section. And you can do the filtering all by what we just talked about in terms of supervisory, district level, the type of facility, and then whether or not it's an individual building you want to be doing. And then all of the costing data associated with whatever your filtering selection is then shows up on this table. And then if you so choose, you can see that over in the left-hand bottom corner of the top table of the 5-year spending, the total renewal costs, there's that arrow pointing down into like an inverted box. That's the download icon. And if you click on that, it will then download this to an Excel spreadsheet. And then you can print that out and use it. This is what was going to be an initial first attempt at the 5-year capital plan, at least to help 5-year capital plan, because this takes the costs for each of the ensuing 5 years and shows it by facility. If you were to do this at a district level, it would show it by facility for your district, what each facility expected cost would be if you were to follow their replacement schedule that they've lined out. And we can talk about that further with some Q&A. All right, next slide. This one is the last tab of the dashboard, and this is the comparison tab. This might be very useful at the state level in terms of the legislature or anybody else if they were starting to think, how do we compare one facility to another facility to see if one has a larger cost burden going forward than another. So the top and bottom blocks all have to do with data that you pick, again, from the filtering section on the side. So if you were within a school district and you had 4 elementary schools and you wanted to compare what are the costs of one elementary school to another, you could just pick those 2 facilities, and this would give you the relative comparison of the costs associated with that facility. And then it's always comparing its difference from what the state average is to what each of these facilities numbers are as well. So this could be a good way for decision makers to start taking a look at things and doing relative comparisons of one district to another, one school to another, or one facility type to another. Are our elementary schools, how are they comparing with middle schools? And so I think you can slice and dice the data as is most meaningful to you individually. And so I think there's a lot of value that can have from this. And it just depends, I think, what the end use of the data might be. So that's the end of the dashboard review. And then I think we just have one more slide after this. So yeah, next steps going forward. This is the public-facing facilities dashboard. There's another dashboard that has a little bit more data mining capability that will be for the state level. And then the most exciting phase of all of this is the capital improvement plan phase, where through the dashboard, not this dashboard, but the capital planning dashboard, school districts will have the opportunity to build their capital improvement plan in a very nice way. It wouldn't be dumping that Excel spreadsheet that we just covered a couple of slides back, but this here is where you actually take a look at all of the assets that have been identified. And if you think this year you want to do boiler number 6, you just click on that asset and you drag it into the project budget. And then you just build your budget by clicking what assets you're planning to replace this year. And then for every asset that you bring over, it then runs a totalized option at the end. And now it does that for each calendar year going forward that you choose to do it. So I think it will be wonderful. The only downside to it, you know what? Let's see. I won't get going on that yet. Maybe what I should do is say that's the next step for the capital improvement plan. There's continuing work that we're doing with the operations and maintenance manual, continuing work on facility manager training curriculum. And then, of course, there's always the ongoing work that the AOE does in supporting any kind of topics around school construction and the use of whatever data comes out of this dashboard to help inform that. So that's really it for the dashboard. So certainly would love to take any questions that people have.
Yeah, Elizabeth, go ahead.
Hi there. I joined a little bit late, so my apologies. I wasn't able to get in for like 9 minutes, so I don't know if this was mentioned at the very beginning or not. So if it was, my apologies. Am I correct that all of the data that has gone into this on all of our districts comes from the assessments that were done a while back from the AOE?
Yes, that's correct, Elizabeth.
Yes. Okay.
That's-
So when we received ours, we went through ours with like a really fine tooth comb, myself and my facilities director who's on this call also. And what we did with ours is we have our own stewardship plan, which is basically in like a Google spreadsheet, and each school had its own tab in that spreadsheet.
Right.
And we have it mapped out all the way from year 1, current year, to year 20, and we just keep on updating it as each year passes, and we do certain projects or fix things, and we just keep updating it. We took those facilities assessments and compared them to our data and just tried to map them. And in some cases, there was something on the assessment that we hadn't caught, so we added it to our facilities plan. And then other cases, there's some disagreement, positive or negative, right? Like some things, like for instance, maybe it listed a bunch of windows that needed to be replaced on a particular building as of a certain time, and it estimates a cost on the assessment data. And when we've bid out a project, it came in a lot higher. And in some cases, it goes the other way around, right? Like, so it can be positive or negative, but nonetheless, in some cases, maybe it doesn't agree with necessarily reality. Is there going to be a method by which we can update the data for our own schools in this new tool, based on what we have for data versus the assessments?
Yes, that is the goal. So the goal is to be at what cadence that update will happen. Not quite sure yet. Will it be quarterly? Will it be semi-annual? Will it be annually? And the methodology of how that will happen still has to be mapped out, because there's concern, and I guess rightful concern, on the part of BVTA. They don't want many people going in and potentially corrupting the database through data updates. So we're going to have to come up with a mechanism for interfacing with that database. And that's going to be part of, once they get their capital plan module done, that's the next phase that we have to work through, is how will that format of that data updating take place? But the idea conceptually is that the school district would have a district accessibility account that you would only be able to get in and do any kind of modifications of data just affecting your district.
Okay,
And
that
that-
makes sense.
that-
Yeah.
Yeah, and that has been a common observation right from, geez, first week I joined. I think there are certain things that certain assessors see, and based upon what their specialty is, I was starting to see a trend where architects seem to see more of the superficial visual impacts, marred paints, marred sheetrocks, even though their functionality was quite fine. Others were looking more from an engineering perspective at the equipment and saying, my gosh, this boiler looks like it's on its last leg. So I think you have a variability in assessors' focus, because some are engineers, some are architects. And then I think when it comes to costing, that's something I would never hang my hat on, because I think people can identify that there are shortcomings in equipment and buildings, but I think the strength of what we have here is the assets at least have been identified. When it comes time to actually building the budget, yeah, we can pull it out of this BVTA dashboard, and we can take the dollar value that they're saying as a starting point. But if I was a facilities manager, I know I wouldn't trust someone else's assessment in terms of what the dollar value is. I would go out and get a quote to see what the replacement is, and that would become my new capital plan dollar that I would be planning to expend.
Right. And that actually happens with our own, facilities plan. We
Yeah.
tend to do that. We make a wild stab at what the cost is when we first put it in the list. And then once
Yeah.
we get a
Yeah.
quote on something, we have to update it. So yeah, same process. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I think, related, I remember Jonathan, when I was talking to you about your facilities assessment, right? They noticed that there was some pointing on the exterior brick veneer of your exhaust stack that needed repointing. And yet your commentary back to me was they don't even know that the flue gas stack is undersized, the amount of boiler flue gas is going through it, right? Those things you don't capture by a brief walkthrough and taking a look at the veneer brick on the outside of the building envelope, And so there are always going to be things that are gross misses. And they're going to be things that they, like you said, Elizabeth, that people find that we may not have thought of.
Yeah, Jonathan, go ahead. Jonathan, I see you have your hand raised. Did you want to add more to that?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
You're good.
Okay, sorry. So I just wanted to follow up. We did have that conversation. I made a note about that just as kind of a point of reference. When they came and looked at that and looked at the pointing problem in the exhaust stack on the middle school, I think the number that they were throwing around at the time was around $40,000. I have a project planned for next summer to replace that stack, and it's at about 1.2 million. So the order of magnitude is significant in some of these. And to your point,
Oh, yeah.
To your point, the individual doing that assessment perhaps didn't have the specific expertise to do a deep dive. So I looked at it more as indicators rather than data points, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. I think that makes total sense to me. Sure. Yep. Yeah. And I think we've covered it in other forums, but I think the thing to keep in mind for any school districts that are using the facilities assessments, the dollar value cost is simply what is a replacement in kind of the asset that was observed. But I think all of us know that oftentimes when we go to replace something, no longer is it replacement in kind. Nobody is going to replace a 1980 vintage boiler that runs at 80% efficiency. They're not going to go special order an 80% efficiency boiler when we can get a 94% efficiency boiler today. When you do that, the controls change. When you do that, it may be a whole totally different footprint. It may require a different amount of makeup airflow into the room. And so there's a bunch of other costs that start having to be factored in whenever we do a replacement. So the unfortunate part about facilities assessments, the way that they're set up, it puts blinders on, and it only looks at what does it cost to replace the exact thing that I'm looking at. And it doesn't take into account bringing everything up to code compliance since that a piece of equipment was originally installed. And so a common big thing are fire alarm systems, right? A lot of our fire alarm systems are old legacy type FCI 7200 series fire alarms. You can't replace those anymore. When you replace that, you have to put in a whole new fire alarm panel, which kicks into often, it kicks in a whole new fire review of the whole facility. So it turned out to be maybe a 30, 40, $50,000 fire panel replacement ends up being a $500,000 whole new fire alarm system to put in new smokes, new pull stations, new horn strobes, new voice evacuation system. So these costs that are identified in all these facilities assessments are just bare bones costs to replace in kind. If you were to replace a on top of roof insulated roof, once you replace a certain amount of square footage, more than a certain amount, it now kicks you up to becoming compliant with the energy code. And I know some of you have probably heard this before, but when you go up to that next energy code, you're putting more insulation on the roof, which means the snow isn't melting as much anymore, which means the snow load in the winter increases. And are your roof trusses strong enough to hold that additional load? And so there are some schools that have to shovel their roofs off because they're exceeding the load capacity of their roof truss. So these are the realities of it. So when these things are highlighted as a capital renewal replacement item going forward, and they have a dollar value associated with it, typically there's so much engineering that has to go into just replacing this because you're not replacing it in kind. This assessment doesn't take into account becoming code compliant or any of the other things that might come into play. When the assessor says replace the boiler, he doesn't know if all the boiler feed piping has asbestos in it. And now he doesn't capture the cost of what is the asbestos abatement associated with that boiler changeout. Same thing with the built-up roof. He doesn't know if your built-up roof has asbestos fibers in any of the tar products used up there. If it does, it changes the cost dramatically. So I think, as you say, Jonathan, I think it's very helpful to use all of these as observations that then get filtered by your knowledge and experience with your school. And then you can either use them as a budget item, or you can say, no, not a budget item we're going to worry about because we don't necessarily think that that's the right thing. Yes, Elizabeth.
So my only thought in regards to that is this sounds like it'll be a great tool for not only, the state to be able to see what, condition all the buildings are in, especially if it becomes interactive in such a way where we can update the information based on what we actually have for, quotes and projects happening. My concern right now, though, is I heard mention of, the state using this to be able to assess even maybe now what our facilities are in for a state. And I think just saying that in some ways that data is not fully up to date. And then you just mentioned, the fact that it's listed at like a replacement value of what it is today versus what a improved version of that is that we would actually replace it with. And so with that in mind, I'm just concerned about the idea that the state might be using this in a way to compare facilities and see what condition they're in. And I'm just hoping that that is, if we're going to treat this as like, this is our tool, I'm just hoping that the state is also going to do that until we all get to the point where we agree that everything is up to date and it's interactive and it's all functioning in that manner. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I'm totally on board with that. Yeah. I think through the Construction Aid Task Force, through the Construction Aid Working Group, I think it's been clearly articulated that these costs are actually quite conservative. They don't capture the full dollar value commitment required to bring all of the identified assets to bring them up to the replacement value that really is going to be required to do so. So I think that message has been made loud and clear. So that 6.2 billion, that's just a rough idea of what current replacement value. It doesn't capture any of those associated costs that I just mentioned before. So I think that was made clear, and I think it can only be a relative tool for comparison, not the absolute tool. Like the dollar values can't be relied on to be the absolute right number. It can just say this school has a lot more need than this school, but the absolute dollar value doesn't necessarily hold any water because of all the reasons we just said. All right. So as always, if anybody has any specific question going forward when they start using the dashboard and they just want to reach out to me, go ahead. That's just totally fine. Yeah, and then, I think the more that you get familiar with it, the more it'll feel comfortable looking at all the different data. But yeah, I will keep you posted going forward as to where we stand with the capital improvement plan. That will have to have a webinar in itself, and that one will be quite an interactive tool and hopefully helpful. I mean, one of the things that understanding that the facilities assessment was done in a rather fast way, fast and furious, a lot of schools to get done in a short period of time. And because there was only so much money allocated to getting the work done, we didn't get the Cadillac version of facilities assessment. And the one thing that I wish if we had had time to do it perhaps in a way more strategic, it would have been to, for every asset that they identified in the facilities assessment, actually connect it to what your equipment number is locally in your school. Because if Ray or Jonathan have 5 boilers, the facilities assessment identified boiler, 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 boiler. It didn't say this boiler is your Columbia boiler number 2. It didn't say that this boiler is whatever, your Baderas boiler number 4. So when you look at your assets and you want to build your capital plan, you're first going to have to go out and say, hold on, it's showing that this is to be replaced in calendar year 2026. But which boiler physically is it? Is it my Baderas boiler? Is it my Cleaver Brooks boiler? Which one is it? And you guys are going to have to then, of the 5 assets that indicate there's 5 boilers, you're going to have to figure out which one is it. And for you guys, you know what if you have the picture associated with that asset, that's easy for you. But not everything had a picture that necessarily showed the name tag on it. So it has a weakness in that it didn't cross-reference local equipment identification numbers to the VVTA asset identification number. So in some instances, that's going to require some legwork out in the field because it may say water fountain, corridor water fountain. Well, you may have 50 corridor water fountains in your schools, right? And so which one are they specifically saying is running out of time in calendar year 2026 or calendar year 2027? So if we had been able to have more money, perhaps to do more thoroughness, that would have been the one big area that could been very helpful, because then you're actually using your equipment number to build your capital plan directly instead of now having to go do this intervening step. Okay. Well, I guess that's it then. If no one else has any more questions, like I say, if ever you want to reach out and talk facilities assessment, you have my email and you can just reach out to me. Taylor, thank you for leading the intro and doing the slides. I appreciate that. And I guess we'll see everybody at the next webinar on the next phase.
Yep. Thank you all. Oh, Courtney, did you want to jump on? Sorry.
Oh, no, thanks. I was just going to say thank you to Bob for putting this together. And I know the dashboard's been a long time coming, so I'm just excited to see it out there and echo Bob's sentiment that if there are other questions, please feel free to reach out.
Yes. All right. Okay, everybody. Be well.
Thanks all.